historian and biographer Ron Chernow describes someone with imposter syndrome. And I really like this quote because it's pretty direct. And I think the key phrase is that at the end, the unspoken melancholy of the prodigy. The more you know you don't know. The person Chernow was describing was most active during the 1780s, but his actions still influence how we live to this very day. What's his name? Alexander Hamilton. His name is Alexander Hamilton. When he was 10, his father split. 2 years later, he and his mother got sick. Alex got better, but his mother went quick. He moved in with a cousin, and the cousin committed suicide. This is someone who has every reason to suffer insecurities. Instead, he carried on with life and went on to become a decorated war vet, Treasury Secretary to Washington, as in the President, and the title character in Hamilton the musical, of which you may have picked up, I am slightly obsessed. And for better or worse, the system that Alexander Hamilton and the other founding fathers created continues to affect our very day-to-day lives to this day. But despite his own talent, he suffered the same fate as many of us in this room. He was surrounded by super talented people and he suffered imposter syndrome. Wikipedia defines imposter syndrome as this: a concept describing high-achieving individuals marked by an inability to internalise their accomplishments and having a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud, which is pretty dry. I prefer something a little bit more direct. Imposter syndrome is that internal voice telling you that despite objective success, you're shit at your job. The nature of a talk on imposter syndrome does require that I, the speaker, open up. The nature of these talks require allowing you into the speaker's dark places. The nature of these talks require confessing to thoughts the speaker would rather keep to themselves. The nature of these talks require dropping the veneer of confidence and allowing the self-doubt to shine. The nature of these talks asks something of you as an audience member too. They ask you to acknowledge all of that. As an aside, and I'm going to get quite meta here, I got a little bit worried writing this talk. I got nervous and was unsure I'd be able to fulfil my promise to deliver it. And I've delivered talks before, many times, and I basically got imposter syndrome in the process of writing my talk on imposter syndrome. But there's a reason, though, that I asked you to acknowledge the nature of these talks, and it's the very reason that I got nervous. Usually Peter Wilson, the self-confident character that's based on my life, presents these talks. But today, the real me is presenting with all my human flaws. Today, I'll be talking about imposter syndrome from the perspective of a developer. For developers, there's an increasing number of tools to learn. New frameworks are always being developed. New tools are being developed for existing code bases. And I'm sure it's the same for other web professionals, writers, illustrators, marketeers. And you know what? I reckon it's probably the same in other industries too. But I can't speak to any of that. I can only speak to myself as a developer. For developers, it's not helped by the "you're not a real developer if" meme, often expressed as some form of hashtag. And the sentiment might boil down to something like this: you're not a real developer if you use WordPress, Drupal or Joomla. Now, I've chosen this tweet for a couple of reasons. It's old, and it's also a quote. So what I'm saying is don't go, tracking down the author of this. And my immediate reaction to such tweets and comments is to think immediately that they're hogwash. It's about as logical as tweeting that you're not a real developer unless you can debug this JavaScript without converting it from its binary form. It's ridiculous. It's obviously CSS. If you can open your editor of choice and write code that works as you intend, you are a real developer. If you've set up your editor with coding tools and with tools to help make your coding life easier, you are a real developer. But it's more than that. You don't need the validation of some randoms on Twitter telling you what is or isn't real development. So they're the thoughts I have when someone tries to tell me I'm not a real developer. But that's not the bit that sticks. That's not what the devil inside says. What the devil inside says is far more hurtful. You're not a good developer. I mentioned during my introduction that these talks require removing the veneer of confidence. These are my thoughts without it. I can see that objectively I'm successful. It's just that one day my career is going to come crashing down around me. I've made this comment in front of groups of various sizes before. I see myself as a front-end developer who knows enough back-end to be dangerous, which was never entirely true, but is a nice self-effacing way of saying that I started as a front-end developer before becoming more broadly skilled. What is entirely true is that I came to the web from the front end, and my first book on web development being a first edition HTML for Dummies in 1995. What is also true is that I spend my day working with developers who've been working with good, honest, proper programming languages for their entire career. They most certainly didn't start with the Programming for Dummies book in the mid-1990s. One of the weirdest things that happened to me last year was in a Slack channel. An open source project I contribute to a lot is Wordpress. Now, I am aware that Wordpress doesn't have an exactly stellar reputation. Most people who work with Wordpress on a day-to-day basis are, but we just spoke about how harmful the "you're not a real developer" meme is. Anyway, it was Eurovision weekend, which in our household is called the happiest weekend of the year. So I was in a pretty good mood. I'd opened up Slack and there was a message from one of the WordPress lead developers. Helen Husandi, one of the developers I most admire, had sent a message asking to talk to me. Because the devil inside me tells me that I'm not a good developer, my first thought was to assume that I'd shut the bed and done something wrong. I couldn't think what it was, but I nervously replied, pretty much hoping to get everything out of the way so I could go on and enjoy the Eurovision semi-final that night. Australia was on. The message that came back was quite different. The message that came back was an invite to be a guest committer for the project. At home, this led to pandemonium, me sort of yelling what the hell type noises at my partner and then telling him to shut up when he dared answer. My inner monologue tells me that I'm not a good developer. But I was in a good mood because it was Eurovision weekend, so I made a decision on impulse to accept. I mention this because, as I mentioned, I've always considered myself a front-end developer. When I go for jobs, I talk about being a front-end developer. By way of comparison, the people who contribute to WordPress write the software that powers a good deal of the internet. On the other hand, I can recreate the blink tag in about 6 lines of CSS. These days, I find myself writing more PHP than anything else, but I spend a lot of time on Google looking up the documentation. My inner monologue likes to make a good joke about being endorsed for guesswork on LinkedIn. Every now and then, one of the real developers will give me some good, honest CSS to sink my teeth into, because it's nice to have a proper, honest front-end developer around when they're needed. And my internal monologue rejoins that it's not worth wasting a real developer's time just to do the CSS. My inner monologue is a real bastard. So that's a pretty honest demonstration of the kind of thinking that goes into imposter syndrome, my imposter syndrome. But I'm not going to make anyone put up their hands, but I'm pretty sure that some of you recognised a little bit of yourselves in there. Which begs the question, how to manage imposter syndrome? Clear Left is one of the leading digital agencies globally, and they're particularly leaders when it comes to front-end development. And they have a really simple approach to knowledge sharing within their office. They have a skills board. I can look at this skills board and I can see nice and quickly that if I have a question about responsive images, I go to Mark. If I have a question about using media queries within SVGs, then I go to Charlotte. I love this idea for a number of reasons. It's really, as smart as it is simplistic. The skills board says there's an expectation of learning on the job. It says that there are skills you will need to do your job that you do not know yet. Go off, learn them, and just jot a note on the skills board when you've done with your learning. The expectation of learning, though, is not the important bit. The important bit is the reverse of the coin, the expectation of ignorance. It's saying you have the ability to do this, you just don't know the messy details yet. The logic behind development, be it front end or back end, is far more important than any one particular detail. Looking at this board, I really like that it's held together with sticky tape and post-its, a lot like knowledge itself. One of the reasons I feel like an imposter is because I don't know stuff off the top of my head. I need to look it up. A while ago on Twitter, there was what I dubbed the "you're a real developer" if meme. Senior developers with loads of experience were posting their not-so-guilty secrets about how they work. A Google lead confessing to having to look up how to get a string's length in Python every single time they need to do it. Or real developers confessing to copying things from Stack Overflow. I said earlier that you don't need the validation of randoms on Twitter telling you what is or isn't real development. However, when hundreds of people are sharing their own experience as being less than perfect, it's a valuable reminder that yours doesn't need to be either. My morning routine is to open my editor and then open Dash. It seems that this is a good practice, despite what my inner monologue is saying. So what does this mean? How does this help you manage the imposter? Knowing others work in the same way on its own doesn't help. You need to use it to stamp down that inner monologue that's trying to undermine you. How can you do this? If writing 3D transforms on a post-it note to remind yourself that you know how to do something is going to help, do it. If you work alone, write it in the back of your notebook. I use Twitter a fair bit, so I went through and liked and favourited a whole bunch of these tweets to remind me that a lot of people are working in the same way I am. By choosing to manage imposter syndrome, it is possible that you'll never feel like an imposter again. That's a white lie. A 24-carat white gold lie. But these things are supposed to end with on a good note. So I've decided, though, that for me at least, there's probably no getting over imposter syndrome completely. And I expect the same is true for most people. The best anyone can really hope to do is persevere with the veneer of confidence and build up techniques to work around imposter syndrome. I hope you'll bear with me as I go back to my latest obsession, Hamilton the Musical. A good deal of the opening act is centred around the American Revolution, the War of Independence. As you'll recall from the 2016 Tony Awards, the battle at which the revolutionaries effectively won independence, both in fact and in fiction, was the Battle of Yorktown. In the fictionalised version, one of Hamilton's mates, Hercules Mulligan, what a name, Hercules Mulligan infiltrates the British Army as a spy, and he returns victorious with this rap. See, that's what happens when you're up against the ruffians. We in the shit now, somebody's got to shovel it. Hercules Mulligan, I need no introduction. When you knock me down, I get the fuck back up again. For whatever reason, some days imposter syndrome will knock you down. My best advice doesn't come on the day, it comes the day after. Be a ruffian, get the fuck back up again. Some days your inner monologue will make that hard to do. Other days you'll be able to swap the self-doubt for self-confidence. But there's a problem with this advice. Just get back up again. Just get back up again. It's terrible advice. It's terrible, terrible, terrible advice. So I'm going to go with another Hamilton quote and try and sort of clarify my thinking behind this. Although a completely different Hamilton this time. Samuel Hamilton from John Steinbeck's East of Eden. And he says, describing the way he works, suppose a disbelief in myself forced me to do a magic to bring to the surface a thing I already know. Does that make sense? Deciding to be a ruffian, the character that I play on stage, and push yourself up is the magic. It's the trick. It's the character you play to get over the self-doubt. It's the character I play on stage and sometimes in the office to bring back the self-confidence. I just remind myself, oh, the ruffian would do that. Does that make sense to you? No. Doesn't make sense to me either, but it works and it helps me get over the feeling of being an imposter. And I hope you can find a trick that works for you. My name's Peter and I'm a ruffian. Thank you.